had previously lived near a homeless shelter in downtown Boston, and after spending a few months there, I got used to the way things worked. When dusk fell, the shelter would open its doors and the beds would fill up. For those who found themselves outside when the beds were all taken, it was left to survival alone that night. Usually there were about 10 people there, but sometimes on some nights, there could be as many as 25 outside. So late-night meetings happened quite often, and I never got to sleep. One day a story happened that I remember forever. It was already quite late that night when I was coming back from a friend's apartment in the North End. I tried to hurry back because it was very cold. Mid-January in New England can be extremely harsh, and in Boston the wind tunnels were adding their contribution as well. When I left the apartment, it had just started snowing. It was a weekday and well past midnight, so the streets were empty. By the time I got halfway down the road, almost half a foot of snow had already accumulated. My landmark was a 7-Eleven store in the theater district, and as soon as I saw its fluorescent green and white sign, I knew I was almost home. Since my apartment was a block away, I bent down with my head down to shelter myself from the harsh and cold wind. On my way home, I turned onto one of the main streets, but then the wind picked up with such force that it howled like an airplane. I had to decide to turn into an alley to get away from the wind. Otherwise, I could definitely break my nose. As I entered the alley, I found that there was no wind and there was even heat coming from the vents behind the buildings. I felt relieved, confident in my right choice. But shortly afterward, I heard a noise ahead of me, then a faint laugh. The laughter was quiet at first, but grew louder with each passing second until finally this guy came out from behind the generator in the cage. This guy's appearance was a nightmare. He was tall, at least 6 feet 8 inches, and terribly thin, as if he had been starved. He had no hair, was wearing a tattered blue sweater, and was swaying around with his fingers clenched and a black liquid flowing from his mouth. He mumbled something, laughed, mumbled again, laughed, and kept going. I couldn't hear what he was saying, and his words probably didn't make much sense. He paid no attention to me, being in his own world. I felt like I had been standing there for too long, so I decided to make a hasty exit. I turned around and quickly walked in the opposite direction. I came out of the alley and turned onto the icy street again. I walked backwards to take cover from the cold. I put on my hood and paid no attention to my surroundings. Suddenly to my left, a few steps away, there was a guy doing the same thing. He was barefoot in a snowdrift and wasn't making eye contact with me. I turned and headed toward him, always keeping my head down. I knew the way. I just wanted to see that 7-Eleven. And finally, I did see him. I turned around and quickly walked in the opposite direction. I came out of the alley and turned onto the icy street again. I walked backwards to take cover from the cold. I put on my hood and paid no attention to my surroundings. Suddenly to my left, a few steps away, there was a guy doing the same thing. He was barefoot in a snowdrift and wasn't making eye contact with me. I turned and headed toward him, always keeping my head down. I knew the way. I just wanted to see that 7-Eleven. And finally, I did see him. He walked with a serious look and I went straight inside. I went upstairs and closed the window. I didn't feel like looking outside. I just wanted to forget everything that had happened. After that, I never saw him again. I come from a state where it's always hot and I've never been a fan of this weather. So when winter comes, I openly express my joy and enjoy the time outdoors. The average temperature at this time is around 50 degrees, but it doesn't matter. One of those winter evenings was chilly. I was only a 10-year-old boy at the time, and there were only my 2 babysitters and me in the house. They were in another part of the house, busy watching television, and I was in my room. Finally, when nighttime came, I decided to take a shower and go to bed. I got out of the shower and got ready for bed. Now I need to tell you a little bit about my room. It is rectangular in shape and has 2 windows facing the front doors of the house. I could see the path leading to my doors outside the windows, which was brick-lined. So the path would lead you to the driveway and then you would turn left and follow it to my doors. My bed was opposite one of the windows and I could always see all the way down the driveway. Both windows were protected by nets. and that's when the real terror began. As I mentioned, the window opposite my bed was open to let in the cold air. My room was quite dark, so it was hard to see anything through the window, but as soon as I turned off the light, I saw the silhouette of a man with his face pressed against the netting. At that moment, I felt his penetrating gaze on me. He was motionless and smiling. His face had hair on it as if it were covered with fur, and the hair on his head was the same length. For a second, I thought I was just imagining it, and I was just seeing a branch outside the window. I took a couple steps toward the window to make sure that what I was seeing was actually real. All of this happened in about 10 seconds. I jumped out of the room and ran to the babysitters who were in the room. The hallways in our house were narrow and long, and the large windows faced the entrance. I didn't dare look outside. I ran to the room where the nannies were and told them what had happened, but they just laughed. Honestly, it was a classic wolf shepherd situation. I've always been a bully and a dreamer, so I wasn't taken seriously. I had to beg them to check my room, and from what I remember, they took it seriously. We got to my room, but there was no one in it. The netting on the window was still intact, and the man was gone. I'm not sure how much they believed me as well as my parents. I couldn't sleep in my room for days because of this incident, and nothing was done about it. Also, we had no security system in the house, so there is nothing to stop this man from coming back. I am still very disappointed in the way things turned out and that there was nothing I could do. I can't imagine how much time this guy spent there watching me get dressed after my shower. I remember how awkward he was smiling. His smile was menacing. I'm satisfied that this man didn't do me any harm, and this was his only visit, at least I hope so. I stopped opening the windows at night and really missed the cool winter air. Although the story of the guy who went to the store to get cigarettes and didn't come back may seem unusual nowadays, when I was young, such a case was quite real. I always thought it was just an excuse moms used to justify to their kids to explain why their dad left them. However, when I was in junior high school, I learned how true this excuse was. My friend's father worked undercover for the local police force for the entire time I knew him. Although he was often gone for long periods of time, his family always knew he was working on the next case and would be sure to return. One morning, he went to the store for cigarettes as usual. It was a cold winter day when most people prefer to stay home. He said he would come back as soon as he bought cigarettes, but he never came back. He had just finished working on another case that had kept him away from home for over 4 months, and his family was looking forward to seeing him. Apparently, he planned to return, leaving his badge and gun at home. Putting on a light coat, he walked off into the unknown. The investigation into his disappearance went on for quite some time, but it eventually reached a dead end, with many important questions unanswered, especially by the police department. His wife faced obstacles at every turn, especially when it came to the nature of his work. The police department told her only that the scope of his duties was broad and varied. After not receiving any new information or answers to her questions for almost 2 years, she decided to hire a private investigator. Since he had previously worked as a police officer in their local area, she hoped he would be able to get information not available to her. The detective agreed to take the case, but she did not hear from him for nearly 3 months. Just when she was beginning to suspect that the detective had deceived her, he suddenly called her. He invited her to his office and told her everything she had been waiting to hear and more. It turned out that her husband had actually been working undercover in the state's drug business for 15 years, if not more, and had connections even outside the country. In his last case before his death, he continued to work undercover for a local group that manufactured and marketed methamphetamine and had ties to Mexican drug traffickers. At the conclusion of the investigation and arrests, he returned home. Unfortunately, several of his former partners who had been arrested with him learned that he had been working undercover. They contacted their contacts in Mexico and demanded he be killed. In the United States, the unwritten rule for drug traffickers was not to harass police officers. However, no such rule existed overseas, and in this case, in order to maintain a good working relationship, they agreed to murder. They spent some time trying to locate the officer and his residence. So one cold and quiet winter morning, they caught him going to the store. All of this information came to the attention of the police about a year after her husband disappeared. One of the jailhouse informants told a story he overheard and wanted to trade it for a deal on his case. When he was heard the story, the deal was made. Now, with the information and a few names, the police began to move forward, embedding another undercover agent in the organization. They knew the suspects would be very cautious, so the officer had to be unhurried to gain their trust. He did what it took and finally gathered all the evidence he needed to stop the trafficking and convict her husband's killers. The private investigator had known about it for a long time, but could not tell her until the arrests were made. That day morning, he called her to inform her of all his findings. The arrests began. He was given permission to reveal to her everything he knew. The private investigator told her that in all his years of working, both in and out of law enforcement, he had never heard of police officers being able to go undercover for such a long period of time, especially at the local level. Several other narcotics officers confirmed to him that they had heard of her husband's request to transfer out of the unit, but that the transfer had been consistently blocked. This information was consistently accompanied by a reminder that police departments rarely admit guilt, and she should dismiss the idea that one of their officers had admitted guilt in her husband's death. She took his advice and thanked him for his work. In the coming weeks, her husband's remains would be found and buried. I attended the burial, and there was clearly a bitterness in it. For a long time now, everyone had given up hope that he was still alive and was just happy that he was back, and what had happened had come to light. I soon left for college and lost touch with my friend, but continued to follow the case and was happy that his father's killers were found guilty. They have both since been executed, and I hope they burn in hell.